非常感谢大家光临，支持我们。另外一方面也非常感谢金九六同学对我们的鼎力支持。他其实明天就要出发去英国交流了，所以我们今天这次是星期四，然后这个学期的其他活动应该都会在周末，星期天下午3点到4点左右这个时间，但是地点应该还是会在这边。然后再先预告一下我们这学期剩下来有什么活动，就是现在已经确定好的，大家不知道有没有人知道加藤加一的，是个日本学者，他现在在美国访问交流，所以我们大概10月26号或者27号会把他请过来，给我们讲一个就是他在美国发现的中国这样一个话题。然后我们也请到布朗的教授Dor Levy， 他来讲一讲中国《红楼梦》。对，然后呢可能会请到朱青石，但是他还不确定，所以也请大家随时关注我们。那现在我们欢迎这边是有一些他的那个专业术语，大家可以随时参照一下，因为讲都是用英文，所以。
Yeah. So thank you for coming, and yes, this is going to be in English, so I hope everything is intelligible to you. And sorry to Pepe for making a move to a Thursday. I know you guys are always on Sunday. Yeah. So the topic today is ancient Chinese glass. Before I start, I do have to say I'm just an undergraduate, by no means a specialist in any of this. So take everything I say with a healthy dose of skepticism. But having said that, this is meant to be really introductory and informal. So let's get started. Glass is a very ubiquitous material, so much so that we don't really notice it around us, but once we stop to think about it, we realize it's everywhere, and we probably couldn't function as a society without this material. Before I get into the good stuff, before I talk about Chinese glass and show you tons of pictures, we should talk a little bit about what glass is. Yeah, what is glass? Again, this is all very basic and introductory, but essentially there are two kinds of glass. One is natural, such as obsidian, and the other one is man-made. We're obviously talking about man-made glass today. Properties of glass. Glass is a very strange. I'm sure there may be a few chemists in here. Maybe no.
Who's studying chemistry?
Oh, okay. You got me out. Yeah, glass is very strange because it's neither liquid nor crystal. It's sort of an amorphous in between with properties of both. I think the important thing to take away from this slide is that glass is actually it's a very strong material. We think of glass as being really fragile. You drop it, it breaks. But it's actually quite structurally sound. It doesn't break easily. Before I go into that, I'll actually talk a little bit more to the properties of glass. So glass is actually very hard. It absorbs heat. It's resistant to chemicals, and just these other properties that make it more durable. We wouldn't really think that glass is really durable, but it is. And this slide is talking about how we make glass. I don't know if you guys have seen pictures of glass making, but you have essentially 3 main ingredients plus the 4th additives is like the cherry on top kind of, which is not essential, but you have the 3 main ingredients. The first one is called former, so it's basically sand, essentially. When you heat up sand, you get a viscous material that forms the basis for making glass. Then the second component is called the stabilizer, and what the stabilizer does is once glass is fully made, it prevents damage to the glass, so it prevents any sort of deformations from occurring. Without the stabilizer, the glass corrodes and it just wears out really quickly. It wouldn't be viable to use. The third material is what's called the flux agent, and a variety of different materials can be used as the flux agent. And what the flux agent does is essentially you have a batch of glass, this molten glass, of viscous material, but in its raw state you can't really work with it. It's not very malleable. But once you introduce flux agents into it, then it makes the molten glass very sort of sticky, and you can make shapes out of it, etc. It's a very basic way of explaining it. But I guess salt is a very common flux agent. Today we're going to be talking about lead mainly. In China, lead was the flux agent that was used. The fourth ingredient is, it's like cooking. And the fourth ingredient is mainly different chemicals. When you add different chemicals into a batch of glass, it normally gives it different colors. So if you add iron into the batch, that gives it a green color. Copper makes it blue. When you add some manganese, it makes the glass colorless. So most natural glass is actually not transparent and clear. You have to make it transparent and clear by adding some other things to the batch. And that's how you get different colored glass. You know, you have purple glass, red glass, every color of glass imaginable. So basic introduction into how you make glass. And to give you, before we jump into China, I want to give you a sort of frame of reference for understanding glassmaking and the origins of glassmaking. We think that glassmaking was first discovered maybe 4,000 years ago in today what is Syria, in this region. It's really up in the air how that process came about, but we do know it's roughly 4,000 years ago. And the oldest Egyptian glass that we have securely dated is 3,500 years old. So glass is a very old material. People have known how to work with it for a long time. And in the West, in the Near East, you have a glass system called soda, lime, silica. It's more chemistry, but essentially, the first part represents the flux agent, the second part is the stabilizer, and the last part is just the sand former. And we call it soda, lime, silica because it uses those ingredients in the making of the glass. And the pictures, can't really talk too much in depth about them, but they're very typical examples of Western glass. So the picture to the right is very typical of Roman glass, 罗马帝国的. So the green probably means that there's iron in the glass, right? And then the one on the one on the left is very typical of Greek and earlier Egyptian glasses. Can't really talk about those too much today because we want to get into China. China is very interesting because in the West you have just one main glass system. You have others, but they're really marginal. In China you have 4 sort of major glass systems, and without getting into too much, in fact, I really won't talk about the other 3 because the important one is lead, barium, silica, lead, barium glass. So this is the glass that uses flux agent, or lead as the flux agent, and barium as the stabilizer. You can see the dates. It's Warring States to the end of the Han, so it's a fairly sizable period in Chinese history that this glass system was prevalent. Now you might be asking, why is lead being used in making this glass? Because in Europe, in the West, they're using mostly salt as the flux agent. And it has a lot to do with what natural resources are available. From the map towards the south, you can see the Yangtze River, the Changjiang, and around that, in what is today Hunan, you have a lot of lead and barium. So these resources are readily available for people to use, and that's probably the main reason why they were making lead barium glass, as opposed to using some other material. And this has even led some scholars to believe that the Chu state Chuguo, that's where the Chinese sort of glassmaking tradition originated, and that the uses of glass, which I'll talk about later, also sort of tie into and have roots in Chu state ideology, religious beliefs. Okay. The chronology also very important. So I have a timeline here from the Neolithic to the 6 dynasties. Lead barium glass, as I mentioned before, was from Warring States to the end of the Han. And I have a few key dates. So around 400 BC, we think we have the start of the glass making industry in China. So we have a lot of glass objects excavated from this time period. And we also have the first possible textual reference to glass, which is in the next slide. And around the turn of the millennium, you have Roman glass in China. So what that means is that by 0 AD, you already have trade going on between the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire. And we find Western glass, we find Roman glass in the tombs of Han kings. And then the last date, which I'll get to in a little bit later, but there's some textual evidence to believe that glass blowing is introduced in China at 424. And what glass blowing is, I couldn't talk about this, but when you make glass, you have several different techniques. And the earliest one is called core forming, which, should I describe it? No. But glass blowing is what we still use today. It's basically when you have a long rod and you have glass at the end, and I'm sure you've seen videos of this, and you blow into the glass, you spin it, yeah. And this technique, what it essentially allows people to do is make a lot of high quality glass in a short amount of time. So it essentially allows the mass production of glass. And that's actually why before around 400 C or 480, glass isn't that big in China. You don't have a lot of glass objects. I'll also get to that in a bit. Okay, I mentioned the earliest textual reference to glass, which happens in the Liezi. It also comes, the same story occurs in the Huainanzi. And basically, the story is that the collapse of a pillar supporting heaven causes damage to the sky, and Yuan has to, quote, smelt stones of all 5 colors to patch up the flaws. And when you look at this, you might not think, okay, where's the reference to the glass, right? But the famous sinologist Joseph Needham seems to think that this reference to the 5 colors is a reference to how glass is very iridescent, so you can see the 5 spectral colors. And he seems to think that this is possibly the first textual reference to glass. We'll never really know, I guess, but a couple hundred years later in the Beishir, you have this really interesting passage. So during the time of the Emperor Taiwu, you have traders coming to China who said that by fusing certain minerals, they could make 5 colors of glass, of lily. And so they're talking about the same 5 colors, but in the second passage, you have what's clearly a reference to glass. So maybe this is sort of a way that early Chinese writers are talking about glass. Some sort of, you make something out of 5 colors, and you'll see in a minute, even the early Chinese were really confused about what glass actually was, which is really interesting. Okay, types of lead bearing glass. You have a variety of different types of objects made using glass. The picture over there is a little stamp. You also have, those are ear spools, so basically ancient earrings, essentially. You have a lot of beads, which are strung together to make jewelry. And in fact, jewelry and beads, they represent the single largest category of glass objects that were excavated or that still survive to this day. According to one scholar, she thinks that up to 80% of all glass, all ancient Chinese glass we have today are beads. So it's a significant portion. Unfortunately, I'm not really going to talk about that today. I did this research as a freshman and it was too big to tackle, so I focused on other things. You have animal figurines, so those are pigs. They're cute. You have cups. In fact, cups are really, really rare. That's a very rare example, and I'll get into why you don't have cups or bowls in just a minute. And it's really counterintuitive because today, what do you think of when you think of glass? You think of cups. But I'll get to that in a minute. That is a decorative object. It's when you have a sword, it's the pommel. And what else? We have glass plaques, so thin plaques. And believe it or not, this was used to make clothing, and I'll get into that later as well. And jade, or not jade, glass bead. So those are ritual objects, and it will be the focus of the talk, so I'll get into that later as well. But just giving you an idea of what kinds of, oh yeah, if you have questions, feel free to jump in, it's really
Yeah. Can you tell me why it's not transparent?
Which ones?
All things like these are not transparent.
Yeah, so basically when transparent glass is really hard to make.
Oh.
And essentially they didn't have the technology for that yet, which was one reason why Western glass from Rome, from the Roman Empire, were really prized in China, and you find a lot of emperors and kings buried with them, is because Western glass is more transparent. And part of that is technology. The other part of that is when you use lead, you don't really get transparent. You get really deep, brilliant sort of colors. You don't really get transparent colors, or the quality of transparency. Yeah. Well, I always show this slide because people ask, those are really big to be earrings, right? How did they put them on? And you have a clay model of someone with it. You can't really see out the back, but those particular ones are like 4 centimeters. Pretty big. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that you don't have a lot of cups and bowls. Why is that? It's essentially because when you make glass using lead, it makes the glass very vulnerable to heat. So when it's exposed to heat, it cracks or breaks. I guess glass today also, you can't really heat it up, it'll crack. But the problem with lead barium glass was, let's say you're a Chinese person 2,500 years ago, you want to drink something. What do you want to drink? Well, you can drink water, I guess, but you would probably more often drink something like tea, something hot. And then you would pour it in a glass cup and it would break, so it's really not practical to use glass. You also have to remember that China is home to a really advanced ceramic industry. So why use glass when you have porcelain cups? So these are very rare examples. In fact, the excavation report for this tomb said that the excavators at first didn't even know that this was glass. They thought it was something else. And they took it to the lab to examine it, and then they found out that's glass. And that's because you don't really have glass cups and bowls, so they were quite surprised by that. More examples. I think those were described as wine vessels. Liu Sheng is going to come up later on as well. Okay, so a little bit about the sort of terminology. Really is a term that first occurs in Han period texts. And the word we use today, I think, is poli, right? That doesn't occur before 500 AD. So in the time period we're talking about, we're really talking about when you want to go look at ancient texts and try to find reference to glass, then liuli is probably the word you're going to use. There's a theory that liuli is from a Sanskrit word, so further from the west, and it doesn't mean glass, it means lapis lazuli, or it means these other precious minerals and gemstones. And that's very interesting because in Chinese texts as well, you see that liuli doesn't only refer to glass, it also refers to various different materials like crystal, and it's basically what you should take away from this slide is that it's a mess. No one knows what they're talking about. When some people are saying liuli, they mean glass, like we understand it. Some people are using the word to refer to crystal. Some people look at a glass cup, let's say, and then they think it's crystal because they really haven't seen much glass before, and then they write, oh, it's liuli. Some people look at glass and they think it's crystal, so it's really complicated, right? And no one really knows what they're talking about. And Yan Tielun, so in that text is a list of prized exports from the West, or from outside of China coming into China, and it mentions crystal. And I read a translation at that to get that actually. But when I went back to look at the original text in Chinese, it said liuli. So it's very confusing. Like people today, even you can't really translate it one way or the other because we don't really have the objects in front of us to say that's glass, that's not glass. So we don't really know. In another text, this is a very interesting text. So it says the crystal vessels, which are made outside China, are in fact prepared by compounding 5 sorts of mineral ashes. So you have this idea of using 5 different sort of colors or materials to make glass again. But what's more interesting is that the author of this text thinks that this glass is, now if one tells this to ordinary people, they will certainly not believe it, saying that crystal is a natural product belonging to the class of rock crystal. So people they can't necessarily differentiate between glass and rock crystal. And they think, okay, maybe glass is actually crystal, it's just made another way. And yeah, essentially I think what I said earlier still holds. What you should take away from this slide is that it's a mess. You know? Everyone's confused. A good example of how, so everyone's confused about this material glass. What is it actually? And that's why you have glass being used as imitation for jade, for crystal, and in this case for turquoise. There's a very, very famous sword, sword. This is a replica, but the inlays here, they're turquoise. But on the flip side, you have glass. So clearly this glass is also conceived of as being turquoise. You know, it's a very, there's an interchange between the materials. And glass is used to imitate a lot of these precious materials that are not gotten other ways. Let's see. I mentioned jade before, and the focus of this talk is jade. Glass, lead barium glass in early China is most commonly used to imitate jade, more so than any other material. And before I show you the pictures, I need to talk a little bit about why jade is important in early China. This is also very basic, but basically jade is associated with immortality because it doesn't corrode. It's also a very hard material. So you have emperors with a lot of jade jewelry, jade scepters. Sometimes they would drink jade, and also gold to, the elixir of life. They want to live forever. And in Taoism, you have the concept of yuan, so the jade emperor. And what all this means is that when wealthy people die, they have jade objects buried with them, because jade represents immortality, long life. It also represents your social status, because not everyone can afford jade. So by having jade buried with you, it represents your wealth in life. And the single most common object that, the single most common jade object that glass was imitating is the jade bead. And a brief history of the jade bead. They're ritual objects, for the most part found in graves, so they're mortuary. Sometimes we know from text that they were sometimes actually used in real life too. I'm just off the top of my head. Emperors would give their followers jade bead as prizes. There's another text that mentions a defeated general of one army giving his jade disc to the victorious general as a sign of submission. But for the most part, they're found in graves. And the earliest jade bead discs are from the Neolithic period. So that's the one on the far right. And then you have, I've just included one example each from each of the different dynasties. So you have a Shang jade disc, and you have the Zhou dynasty, and Warring States, Han. On the left is a picture of a Neolithic jade deposit. So this is how, just to give you an idea of how they would have buried it underground. There are tons of jade discs and other material as well. The significance of the discs, I don't think people are really clear about it yet, but there's a big clue in the hint, in the shape of the object, which is a round circle. And in the Jiaguo scripts, you have the character for sun, which is a circle at the bottom of it. So it has a connection with the sky. It's religious. It makes sense that people are buried with this. We're not really going into depth about that because art focuses glass. You have glass bead. These are all Han Dynasty, I think, yes. You can see that they're very similar. The ones here are blue, which you really don't get with jade, but other than that, they're very similar. And they also come in a variety of different sizes. Sometimes you have really interesting sort of mixes. So this one is interesting because the disc itself is jade, but in the middle you have a glass bead. And then you would have several of these on what are belts. So you would hang it from your belt, and it would be a status symbol. How did they make the beadis? That's a good question. And this was the only sort of diagram that I could find explaining how they're making these discs. So it's basically like, I guess that really looks like sort of like one of those, yeah, the waffle machines, right? So you would pour glass in the pan, heat it up, and then press it. I don't know if they flipped it, probably not. But that's how they would make it. But the interesting thing is that because the bottom portion of the glass is hotter than the top portion, so you have these little decorations. I don't know if you can see them here. Yeah, you have the little round ridges. You would have the bottom half of the discs would have really clear and nice decoration, but the top portion, because the glass is cooler, it doesn't have really defined the decorations. So glass, not really nice. It's not as nice as jade, but people were still using this, and they were being buried with it just like the jade discs. I'm going to explain why in just a second. For that, we have also textual evidence of glass being used to imitate jade. So in the Union pool, you have, let's see, the whitest of these are compounded with lead and mixed with other minerals. Then after heating it, all is changed into false jade. This is only 1,000 years ago or so. In the next passage, which is also from around 1,000 years ago, it mentions that it's deceitful to make jade by boiling lead with white stone. So these two passages are clearly referencing the making of glass. And then these writers are thinking, it's not really nice, it's cheating, it's basically to make jade with glass. Because glass is much cheaper and easier to come by. But a text from 2,000 years ago, closer to our time period, it says the jade made out of melted jade like stone is as brilliant as real jade. So people back then were saying, glass jade is as good as real jade. Other than glass bead discs, you have an assortment of other materials, other objects that are also made with both glass and jade. And they're all in the mortuary context. So these are body plugs. Essentially, when you bury someone, you cover their eyes, ears, nose, mouth, etc. You can sort of, you can see it. Eyes, nose, ears maybe, yeah. But we can play a little bit, we can play a little game, which one of these is jade and which is glass. Take a guess. It's kind of hard to tell, right? Yeah. Play the answer. There it is. So all of the ones in here are jade. All of the ones outside are glass. So it's hard to tell the difference. And probably, jade preserves much better than glass. So, 2,000 years ago, the glass would have looked nicer than it does now. So maybe a little bit less of a difference between jade and glass back then. You have other examples, cicadas. These are pretty clear. The ones on the right is jade. These would be placed inside the mouth. So this is the very famous jade suit found in Liu Sheng's tomb. Liu Sheng was a prince of the Han Dynasty. I think he was ranking official in the Han Dynasty. And when you're that rich, when you die, you get to have a jade shirt buried with you, or you get to be buried in a jade shirt suit, I guess. So this suit is composed of 2,498 individual pieces, all sewn together with gold thread. So it's probably it's very expensive anyway. And here you can see like the body plugs that were in the slide before. And I bring this up because we actually have glass used to make something just like this. Yeah, this is the one, the Guojia Boguan. I mentioned before, we don't have the actual full suit, but we do have the components they were made from. So these are the plaques, and you would take a bunch of them, string them together, and they would be just the same as the jade suit. These particular plaques were found in a noble woman's tomb, and her suit altogether 600 pieces. So not as grand, not as expensive as the jade suit we saw before, but it's interesting that they're using this, or they're making the same type of object using two different materials. And I'm coming back to this slide because one question is, if you think from the perspective of someone 2,000, 3,000 years ago, maybe you weren't rich enough to afford jade, but you still want something that could have the same effect. When you're buried, you want that connection to the sky. You want your body to be protected by this material, but you don't have the money for it. Then what do? You have to find another material, and there's only one material that can actually be made to look sort of like jade, and that's glass, right? And in the mindset of early Chinese people, this using glass was not necessarily a step down or a bad thing, right? Because, and the real clue is in the third passage, the jade made out of melted jade-like stone, aka glass, is as brilliant as real jade. So it's cheaper, people can afford it, and that's probably why they're using it. And I think people back then thought it would have the same sort of spiritual or symbolic effect that, jade is obviously nicer to have, but if you couldn't have jade, then you would use glass. And that's why a lot of the jade items that were shown just now, they're found in what's called commoners' tombs, unnamed tombs. So they're not the tombs of kings and princes and emperors. They're just lower class people, not as wealthy. Right. So I have to talk about the decline of this glass system. How did this lead barium glass that was so prevalent from the Warring States to the end of the Han Dynasty just sort of die out in the end? And there are a couple of reasons. It's sort of a complicated reasoning process, so hopefully you can follow along. We have a really nice poem that mentions all these great qualities about Western glass. Actually, this passage is not describing Chinese lead barium glass. It's describing soda lime glass from probably the Roman Empire. And the decline of lead barium glass has a lot to do with the introduction of the import of Roman glass into China. And it's not because we were having a lot of Roman glass in China, because it's a very long distance, so you couldn't get that many. You couldn't get that much Roman glass into China, so it was still very rare, and only the top people had Roman glass. Which, good question earlier, which was transparent, and it had these qualities that Chinese glass didn't have. So not only could they be used to drink your tea, I guess, if you wanted to. I don't think they would actually, because we don't really drink tea out of glass even now. But side note. But it looks different. It's transparent. It's shiny. So what is the next natural step? If you can't buy it from, if you can't buy it because it's too far away, it's made too far away, then you want to make it yourself here. And lead barium glass is not really good for that, because two reasons. One, you have to use this glass blowing technique in order to make glass that's similar to Roman glass. And there's reason to believe that in China they weren't really using the technique at the time. And also the material, lead is not really suited to glass blowing. It's not, it's not viscous enough, or some chemistry that I don't really fully understand, but it's not good enough to make similar glass. What you could do is you could put more lead into the glass batch, and that makes the glass more transparent. It gives you sort of the look that you want. It's more similar to the Roman glass. The problem is that when you add more lead into the glass batch, then you damage the furnace. So you damage the tool with which you make the glass. You damage your stove. So you can't really make large quantities of glass. It's just prohibited. You have to replace your stove. You have to replace your furnace too often. And what the Chinese then came up with is they started to replace lead with another flux agent. And the material that they settled on is saltpeter, which is commonly found in Guangxi and Guangdong. This material was known as early as the spring and autumn period, and it was used as a medicinal sort of ingredient. So people were aware of it, and then now they're taking it and replacing lead with it. And the glass that's made using this is more suitable to glass blowing. It doesn't damage the furnace, and it's all around. If you want to make glass that's stronger, if you want to make glass that looks like Roman glass, then you would use this material. There are also two sort of equally important factors. One is that there are new burial customs coming in. So after the Han Dynasty, you have emperors who forbid the use of jade in tombs. So it's banned. You can't. Earlier you would have, you would be buried with jade, but even if you had jade, it was against the law to be buried with the jade. Which means that even if you can't afford the jade and you got the glass, you probably still couldn't be buried with the glass either, right? So after the Han Dynasty, it's just different burial customs. There's no more need for these elaborate jade beadisks, these jade body covering, this jade suit. The last factor is, around 400, 500 AD, you have Buddhism coming into China. And this is a much bigger topic actually, because the introduction of Buddhism changes the way not only glass and jade, but also other materials. It changes the way that these materials are used in China. So it's a much bigger topic. I wanted to mention it because it is very relevant, it is important, but not really getting into that either. Okay, so I mentioned the technique of glass blowing, and there are several theories. The text on the bottom, the Beishir, it describes in 424 AD, roughly that date, you have traders coming to China, and basically what's described here, scholars think that it's a reference to the introduction of glass blowing in China. So from that time, you have the technique of glass blowing in China, and Chinese glassmakers were using it, which may not actually be the case, because you have this text, which is at least more than 100 years earlier probably, which also mentioned today this method is being commonly practiced in what is today Vietnam and Guangdong. And if you recall, this the Chinese replaced lead with saltpeter, and this material was commonly found in Guangxi and Guangdong, so that you have this textual reference to probably glass blowing, because it mentions glass vessels which are made outside of China. In Guangdong, where this material, this raw resource is available, maybe suggests that this technique of glass blowing, or just in general, the sort of movement of Western ideas and Western products into China, maybe it happened towards the south, not in the north. I think I have a map. Yeah, it's a little fuzzy. But essentially you see that the text, the 424 text, this is the route that the ideas would have spread. But maybe what I'm suggesting is they took the sea route and went into Guangdong, and that's where you have the introduction of new ideas and Western class into China. And you also have political division after the fall of the Han Dynasty. So you have different states, which could maybe explain why, if glass blowing was first introduced in the south, then how come it didn't spread to the north? How come they only found out about it when people came from this way, right? It might just be that that political division of China facilitated the process. So this is my last slide. I think it's a particularly apt slide to end with, because what does the study of Chinese glass really tell us? It's a very small corpus of material. You don't have many glass objects. For instance, the glass P discs, you only have maybe 30 of those, and that's it. China's a big country. We've been excavating in China for 100 years, but only 30. In comparison to that, you have tons of bronze and other sort of materials. So it represents only a small fraction of all the Chinese artifacts out there. So what does it tell us? I think it tells us, one interesting thing it tells us is the interaction between the West and China from a very early date. Although Chinese glass, it's an under-researched topic, but people earlier on, the pioneers who were first studying this material, one of the questions that they wanted to tackle was, what were the origins of Chinese glassmaking? Because previously, Western scholars had stated, Chinese glassmaking technology was probably from the West, right? Because whereas in the West, glassmaking we know started maybe 4,000 years ago. In China, it's maybe 2,500. It's comparatively late. And then the earliest Chinese scholars who were studying this said, that's probably not right. What if it was locally discovered, right? So you have it's a glimpse into the fascinating trade between East and West from a very early period. The study of Chinese glass also tells us, it takes us into the mind sort of early Chinese people. We study how they're using glass and how they're using glass specifically to imitate other materials, and you start to see the world sort of through the eyes of early Chinese people. How they were perceiving various materials in relation to one another, in relation to their religious beliefs, how they're using it in that context, how it's a social sort of, it tells us about their society as well. Rich people use jade, if you're not as wealthy, use glass, etc. So it's so this was a really brief introduction, and I'm still very fascinated by the topic. You have a lot of you could further pursue this research in a lot of different ways. And I think even though it's a really small fraction of the Chinese archaeological record, it can still tell us quite a lot about early China, and that's why I think Chinese glass is so fascinating. So thank you, and I'll answer questions. You can try to ask me in Chinese. I don't know if I'll.
你说他们把那个蝉放在嘴里。Why?
So the cicadas, they're animals, or they're insects that represent rebirth and immortality, right? So that's why they would place it in the mouth. I don't know if that's a good enough answer for you. I can't. It's sort of strange. Like ears, you can block, right? But you can't really block your mouth. So yeah, that's interesting.
I have a question. Can you go back to the suit, the body with the jade suit?
Yeah.
Do they? I mean, is there a corpse inside, or they take off?
No.
This is a whole piece of. How can they take apart and make combine together?
So I believe the body was long gone by the time they excavated this tomb. They excavated it in the 60s, I think. But it was really weird because the suit was found totally intact. We have Actually, we have quite a few textual references to jade suits, so we know they're really common. And the emperors, kings were being buried with this. But because most big tombs were looted before they were excavated, we don't really have full sets. So this is why, in fact, Liu Sheng's tomb was also looted, but I guess the robbers, they missed this. So, yeah, for us. Yeah, the body is not inside a sword.